The following serial killers have at least 10 or 11 confirmed murders, and there are some very well known names in this portion. Edmund Kemper, aka the Co-Ed Killer. I do wonder how some serial killers become well known in public discourse, but others that might be more brutal and depraved don't. I can only imagine a slow news day on one particular TV slot forcing the media to latch onto the latest serial killer as an easy story, thus promoting the killer to infamy. Kemper, like Berkowitz, is another killer you'll certainly see on top 10 lists. But this isn't to say Kemper isn't a brutal and terrifying example of a serial killer, and it also isn't to say he's uninteresting because there's a lot going on. Some serial killers aren't just the product of slow news days. They capture something in the public's imagination, and I think for some, Kemper represents that something. If nothing else, he's been alluded to in both Silence of the Lambs and American Psycho as he penetrates popular culture. In Kemper's past, we see perhaps the most notorious tyrant and alcoholic mother in all of true crime, Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper. She abused, belittled, and humiliated her son for years. Kemper was locked in the cellar when he reached puberty, out of his mother's fear he'd rape one of his sisters, and I don't get the impression he was shown any affection at all. This is definitely one of the more Freudian cases. Kemper's father was a World War II veteran who essentially said that being in the war was less stressful than his wife. Kemper had a better relationship with him, but the divorce soon put Kemper at his mother's mercy. Kemper eventually ran away, but wound up living with his grandparents. Kemper didn't like this arrangement. Before this point, Kemper had killed the family cat, and even before then had a history of cruelty to animals, once burying a cat alive, then mutilating the remains. There's also evidence of Kemper being a peeping Tom in his adolescence, and now he'd committed the first of his murders. In 1964, aged only 15, he shot his grandmother and then his grandfather to death. He was arrested and sent to a state hospital. His mental health isn't clear at this point, with the illness paranoid schizophrenia being bandied around and not making sense alongside passive-aggressive personality disorder. But one thing was clear: Kemper's high IQ, at around 136 to 145. This intelligence and his position at the hospital was used to manipulate the mental health professionals and secure him an early release after only 5 years. To be fair to the mental health team, they strongly recommended he stay away from his mother, but unfortunately for everyone, he wound up back in her care. After a while, he started picking up hitchhikers. He did this many times before deciding to strike, much like Bittaker and Norris. Kemper killed 5 college students, and then 1 high school student, over the course of perhaps a year. He'd decapitate some of them like he did with the family cat, and have sex with the severed head. He was once stopped by a policeman when he had corpses in his car, but he stayed calm and moved on. He even tried to be a police officer, but was too tall. At one point, he had a body in the boot when reporting to a mental health professional who determined he was not a danger to society. Back at his lair, he photographed some of the corpses and committed necrophilia on the bodies as well. Later, he would rape at least 1 victim while she was still alive. One detail that struck me as particularly devious was if the potential victims were hesitant to get into the car, he'd claim he was in a hurry and this would put them at ease. It's a small psychological trick, but it reveals a lot. Ultimately, at nearly 7 foot tall, around 250 pounds and a near genius level IQ, no one escaped him. I think these women were mother substitutes. Practice runs for his final crime, where Kemper finally killed his mother. He had sex with her severed head as well. Kemper then invited his mother's friend over and strangled her in an attempt to give the illusion the two of them had gone on holiday. This ruse amounted to nothing because he later turned himself in. Allegedly, he committed cannibalism, but I'm not sure if that's true. It is true he's been a model prisoner and was one of the first to discuss his crimes and his mind with Douglas and Ressler. The lesson I take is, you can kill your tormentor, but it won't make you feel better.
I'm saying I'd wanted to kill my mother since I was 8 years old, and I'm not proud of that.
Dennis Rader, aka BTK. Dennis Rader became one of the most well-known serial killers while completely slipping me by. He was only apprehended after my more colourful edgelord foray into serial killers ended, and is now established as one of the most notorious, becoming the killer representative of Wichita, Kansas. He started his killing with a spree, murdering 4 members of the Ortega family in one day in 1974. He then killed more women in the following years via binding and strangulation. His final victim was in 1991 and brought the total to 10. One person did survive Rader after being shot in the head. It's fascinating how often people seem to survive being shot in the head. The human body really is resilient. During this time, Rader taunted the police and media, and he was motivated by wanting attention from the press. He took a lot of souvenirs and also took photographs of his victims. Ultimately, Rader was caught because he sent a floppy disk the police traced, and they used DNA from Rader's daughter to get a positive identification, arresting him in 2005. This means he was at large for 31 years, meaning he's evaded capture longer than anyone thus far, and he'll keep that title until we reach the bottom 10. Even if we don't take into account Kenneth Macduff's prison time, Rader is still the killer who walked amongst us for the longest time. What made him different? Was he very intelligent? I've heard conflicting reports with regards to that. For example, he didn't have a good command of the English language. What of his past? Like some of the others, Rader had comparatively little trauma history. It's theorised he was neglected by his busy parents, and there was an issue where he was dropped on his head as a baby, but otherwise his background seems relatively peaceful. He was still antisocial as a child with evidence of killing small animals and being a peeping Tom. Yet he seemed very normal, above suspicion. As an adult, Dennis was a pillar of his community, installing alarms, working as a compliance officer, a dog catcher, Boy Scout leader. He was active in his church, married with kids, and so on. He also served 4 years in the Air Force. When he was caught, his family had no idea he was the BTK Strangler, and this brings me to a type of serial killer that has a double life. It's fascinating how they can compartmentalize so thoroughly, or cubing, as Rader called it. His mental health is particularly fascinating to me. The picture I've painted is one of a pure Factor 1 psychopath, but this doesn't match his diagnoses. The first in antisocial personality disorder. Rader doesn't strike me as the impulsive and irresponsible type, and he doesn't strike me as overly aggressive and openly hostile. He certainly had the conduct disorder, but was hardly a juvenile delinquent. ASPD is more associated with Factor 2 psychopathy, not Factor 1, so it's not what I would have guessed. I'm not saying I don't see the ASPD, I still think it's a valid diagnosis, but I think his mind is more complicated than that, which leads me to the next diagnosis. Narcissistic personality disorder is one I have a bit more knowledge about, and it's another one that confuses me in the context of Dennis Rader. The narcissist sees himself as superior. This is a key feature of narcissistic pathology. He is unique, he is special, he is above the madding crowd, and he truly believes this is the case, most of the time. Such a person tends to stand out. Indeed, I think narcissists would consider it an insult to be considered normal. They see themselves as anything but. Take Alcala and Bundy. Both of them have this arrogant, condescending air about them, an insufferable smugness that immediately puts everyone on edge. When I look at Rader, I see someone who went to great efforts to appear normal, and wear the mask of sanity perfectly. I will say that trusting the police might be a clear example of narcissistic naivety. He didn't understand that this was never a game. But maybe he didn't appear as normal in day-to-day life as I imagine. It seems he took almost every little job that could give him even the smallest piece of power, and the demanding attention from police and the media strikes me as very narcissistic. So maybe he wasn't as normal as we think, I don't know. The last diagnosis is obsessive-compulsive disorder, which needs a very intimate knowledge of Rader that I lack. Again, I feel the need to point out I am not a mental health expert. It's arrogant of me to think I can understand him. One might even say narcissistic. Even the details of his crimes are elusive to me. I can't tell if he raped any of his victims. There's some speculation that he revived them after strangulation so he could kill them again, but I'm not clear on just how sadistic and sexual his crimes really were. All of it was from a man who, to all accounts, was a normal American dad. His children thought highly of him and felt loved. And this is a detail that will also be reoccurring. Serial killers are often very hard to detect, so we mustn't judge family members. Even with hindsight, I still have no real clue what went on in his head.
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
Gerald Gallego and Charlene Gallego, aka the Sex Slave Killers. We leave Wichita and return to Sacramento for our next serial killer couple. I'll start with the female of the pair. Born Charlene Adele Williams, her trauma history is low, and like Kenneth MacDuff, there's a suggestion she was spoiled. Her background was privileged, and she was a violin prodigy at a young age with an IQ of 160. But it seems drugs and alcohol became a major part of her life, as did an obsession with sex. She had 2 failed marriages, and some reports suggest she was obsessed with lesbianism and threesomes and drugs and Lord knows what else. Then she met Gerald. Gerald Gallego never knew his father, and that father would be executed for killing 2 policemen. Little is known about his mother, but some reports suggest she was a prostitute who abused him, and I wouldn't be surprised. Gerald had a criminal record at a very young age, and it included a history of burglary and sexual crime. He was married 5 times before he met Charlene, and he had a long history of domestic abuse in those failed marriages. His daughter accused him of sexual abuse against her as well. Before the timeline of their crimes, Gerald and Charlene had an intense and turbulent relationship. There was one occasion where Charlene was caught in bed with another woman, and that woman may have been Gerald's mistress, I'm not sure. Parts of this are quite sensationalized. The Gallegos decided to abduct and sexually abuse young girls, most of them teenagers, with the youngest being 13. They usually picked up 2 girls at a time, which is rather unusual, but I suppose the victims didn't think disaster would befall them in pairs, along with being more trusting of a woman in the vehicle. But upon being lured into the van with various promises, Gerald was waiting with a gun. None of the victims fled or cried out or screamed. They were scared and went along with whatever he wanted, and this resulted in their deaths. Some of the victims were held for more than 24 hours, which I would consider kidnapping, and they were repeatedly raped before being executed. 1 man and 9 women were dead, and one of them was pregnant and was just hitchhiking. When he was done with her, Gerald had actually failed to kill her, and she was buried alive, and perhaps a few others suffered a similar grim fate. Luckily, some witnesses noticed the last abduction involving the male, and made a note of the number plates that allowed police to catch them. And now we ask, what exactly happened? Charlene claimed she was an unwilling participant. Gerald claimed she actively participated, but the gory details of his account aren't available, however valuable or useless that might be. I can't believe how overlooked and buried this case is. Their crimes took place in the late 70s, and maybe by then the general public was sick of hearing about serial killers following some high-profile headline makers, but I don't know for sure. What I do know is Gerald was sentenced to death, and Charlene served around 16 years. If this case has been reminding you of someone else, I know where you're coming from. The Ken and Barbie killers are a more contemporary case that's much more in the forefront of true crime discourse. After the plea deal of Carla Homolka, which got her a lighter sentence, new evidence revealed she was more involved in the crimes than she let on. It's too bad video making software wasn't readily available in the late 70s. Maybe then we'd know for sure regarding Charlene. But if there's no evidence, there's no evidence. I'll admit I found this one more emotionally taxing than the others, and my commitment to professionalism is looking emaciated. I've made several new tags for these two, which I'll discuss in the recap video.
I see it every day. I always see it. It never goes away.
Lonnie Franklin Jr, aka the Grim Sleeper. Called as such because of a 14-year gap between his murders, Franklyn raped and killed at least 10 women, one of whom was only 15. He targeted black prostitutes and drug addicts, knowing they wouldn't stir much police interest. Our first black serial killer since Erskine, but I don't know much about Franklyn's past, although his tendency to exclusively murder black women suggests to me he hated his mother. What is known is Franklyn served in the United States Army, and was discharged for partaking in the gang rape of a West German woman in 1974. His first confirmed murder was in 1985, but one detail that seems incredible to me was there was almost a half-dozen serial killers active in the area at this time, with police understandably getting cases confused as to who exactly the Southside Slayer was. That 14-year gap in his crime spree was after at least 7 kills, ending in 1988, and starting again in late 2002, but he's suspected of some murders in between, before, and since. Supposedly, the birth of his son caused him to stop, and that same son gave a DNA sample after his own criminal activities, which led police to the father. Authorities found hundreds of photographs and videotapes of countless women. It included the victims, but also many women unidentified, which suggests he's killed many more than 10. Franklyn died in prison aged 67 in 2020.
No clue. I have no clue how my DNA would get there.
Robert Joseph Long, aka the classified ad rapist. As the set pieces continue to repeat, Long raped and killed at least 10 women, most of whom were prostitutes. His childhood shows multiple head injuries from swings, falls, being hit by a car multiple times, etc. He was more accident prone than David Berkowitz. While still young, Long shot the family dog out of envy, and also shared a bed with his mother until his teens. Supposedly Levi Belfield also did this. I don't have any details about Long's mental health, but this is the first instance of XXY syndrome killer. I don't know how much, if any, bearing this has, probably none, but I know he struggled because of it. In fact, this may have contributed to his clumsiness. Regardless, Long got married, but yet another accident resulted in him becoming a violent domestic abuser, and after the divorce, the crime spree started. He committed at least 50 rapes over a period of perhaps 3 years before he escalated to murder, and in what can only be described as a raw rampage, he raped and killed those 10 over an 8-month period. So far, that is the most intense reign of any serial killer, and he was showing no signs of slowing down. But one late autumn evening, Long abducted a 17-year-old named Lisa McVeigh. He blindfolded her and took her back to his lair, and raped her for over a day. But she had several aces up her sleeve. McVeigh deliberately left her fingerprints around the scene to aid in any potential investigation. She memorized his appearance, the vehicle, and the route. She even made a note of when she heard him use a cash machine, and then during her whole ordeal she was able to talk to Long into releasing her, promising to be his secret girlfriend. It worked, and she made it home. But when she got home she was beaten. I can't get over that detail, but what's worse is she was already being molested at home and was considering suicide. Lisa McVeigh had been in and out of foster care courtesy of her alcoholic mother, and Lisa had many traits of becoming a serial killer herself, but she didn't become the next Eileen Wuornos at all. And after talking to the cops, they were able to finally catch Robert Long. After an off-the-cuff comment, she pursued a career in law enforcement and still works at Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office today. I can scarcely believe I've come across a story like this. Absolutely incredible. I'm definitely giving her the title of true crime hero. As for Long, he was executed by lethal injection in 2019. McVeigh got a front row seat alongside some of his other victims. And although I don't support the death penalty for even the worst offenders, I must admit, that's a great mental image.
And the worst thing is, I don't understand why. I don't understand why.
Vickie Dawn Jackson. Our first female serial killer since Eileen Wuornos, Jackson is far more typical in what we expect to see from a female killer. She was a nurse who killed 10 people with poison, a muscle relaxant, mivacron chloride in her case. I don't have any information regarding childhood trauma, but supposedly she started killing as an adult after her failing marriages and losing custody of her children. One of her victims was supposedly her third husband's grandfather. She pled no contest to the charges against her, and Jackson's motive has never been established. She may have suffered from bipolar disorder, but I can't get that confirmed. There isn't much else on her at all. Clifford Olson, aka the Beast of British Columbia. Olsen is our second entry from Canada, if you don't count the quick aside for Barbie and Ken. Olsen killed 11, and his oldest victim was only 18. The youngest was 9-year-old Simon Partington, who was abducted, raped and strangled in 1981. Many of his other victims were raped as well, and he had committed many sexual assaults before he murdered. Olsen had an extensive criminal background, and I have his psychopathy checklist score at 38 out of 40. One needs only 30 for a formal diagnosis. Despite this, he seems to have a good relationship with his wife, ensuring that she gets money for his testimonials, another example of a morality pet. There is a bizarre appeal regarding information he claims to have supplied prior to 9/11. In closing, I can't find much in the way of trauma history. I hope I'm missing something and I'll have to look more deeply into him. Olsen died of cancer in 2011, age 71.
A child, no matter how, should never be forgiven.
Marie Alexandrine Becker, aka the Black Widow. Our earliest serial killer since Peter Curtin, Becker was active during the Second World War period in Belgium. She was another poisoner, but not affiliated with the nursing profession, poisoning 11 people via digitalis, aka foxglove. This includes her husband, whom she grew tired of, and then her lover, whom she also grew tired of. The other victims were patrons at her shop, poisoned for what little money they had, so Becker could party all night long. Fortunately, a more moral friend of hers turned her in. Mary Becker was known to attend the funerals of her victims and to gesticulate wildly her grief over their passing. Becker died during the Second World War. Nanny Doss, aka the Giggling Granny. Nanny Doss was also referred to as the Black Widow, but that nickname would become so common it became a classification for female serial killers who kill family, especially husbands. Doss is perhaps more deserving of the title than Becker, given Doss killed 4 of her husbands. She also killed 2 of her children, her sister Dovey, her mother, 2 grandsons, and a mother-in-law. Thankfully, there's a lot more information on the Giggling Granny. Her father was something of a tyrant, and she suffered a serious head injury aged 7, resulting in blackouts, depression, migraines, and presumably budding psychopathy. Her first husband was the one that got away, but he lost 2 of his kids and his mother under mysterious circumstances. He fled Nanny out of fear. Her second husband would last longer, and her existing children would themselves have children. But I think we know what's going to happen, and life insurance paid out handsomely. Indeed, people close to her kept dying, and at one point her house burned down, and Doss collected the insurance on that. It was never proved she burnt it down, but if she did, this is a rare case of female arson. Her final husband had 2 life insurance policies on him, but the autopsy revealed her poison, classical arsenic. She was arrested and confessed, and died in the following year. Vaughn Greenwood, aka the Skidrow Slasher. Continuing the trend of minorities, we have our second black serial killer in this video, and our 5th overall, and the first serial killer to target exclusively men since Eileen Wuornos. After killing 2 elderly men on the notorious Skid Row, an area of immense poverty and hardship in the States, Greenwood went to prison for an unrelated knife crime. When he got out, he went back to stalking the most vulnerable in American society, eventually killing 11 men in total. Targeting the vulnerable is nothing unusual, but Greenwood had supposedly drunk the victims' blood via discarded cups by the bodies, and left salts around the bodies. I don't know the ethnicity of the victims, or the mental health of the perpetrator, but I do think he crossed racial lines. When he started targeting the middle class, the net closed in. Herb Baumeister, aka the I-70 Strangler. The bodies of 11 men were found on Baumeister's property, all taken from gay bars. Baumeister fled to Canada, wrote a suicide note that didn't explain the murders, then killed himself to evade capture. He may also have been responsible for killing a dozen other young men as the unidentified serial killer, the I-70 Strangler. Apparently his trauma history was low, but Herbert would play with dead animals, but not kill though, and urinated on a teacher's desk. This is a strange plot twist on the McDonald triad, but urinating on others or others' property is more indicative of psychopathy and its domineering tendencies, and isn't something done by many children. Baumeister was ultimately diagnosed as a schizophrenic with antisocial personality disorder. Regardless, he got on with his life, had a wife and children, and started the successful Save-A-Lot thrift store chain, and yet he was picking up and murdering all these men. Baumeister clearly lived a double life, but this is yet another case with a lot of holes. Although details may be sparse and unreliable, one thing that's overly reported on is how haunted his old house is said to be. I put no stock whatsoever in these silly ghost stories, but it takes up a disproportionate amount of information, and his old residence is said to be one of the most haunted locations in Indiana.
There was no excuse for that. I mean, the poor thing deserved a better fate than that.
Leonard Lake and Charles Ning, aka the Boneyard Murderers. With these two, there is a lot of ambiguity over how many were killed, how they died, and what happened to the victims before they died. It seems men and children were killed quickly, whilst women were tortured and raped before being killed. I don't know how long the women were kept alive for, but these two individuals had their own compound and dungeon. Looking at the past, after Lake's parents divorced and he lived with his grandmother, we see he had a tendency to take photographs of his naked sisters, and his grandmother even encouraged this behaviour. Supposedly he even raped his sisters, and he killed mice and dissolved their bodies in acid. As an adult he enlisted in the Marine Corps, and while there was diagnosed as suffering from schizoid personality disorder, like Norris and Heidnik. After a mental breakdown he was medically discharged from the Marines, and after indulging in the hippie lifestyle for perhaps 10 years, he met Ning. Born in Hong Kong, Ning grew up under an abusive father, was expelled from schools, and committed various thefts. His pattern for thievery proved lifelong, and continued when he was caught stealing automatic weapons while in the Marines. He was dishonourably discharged for this, and for desertion. He met Lake via a survivalist magazine ad in 1981, a few years before. It seems Lake and Ning developed their fantasies quickly and brutally. Interestingly, Lake was inspired to commit his more heinous crimes after reading The Collector by John Fowles as a teenager. This book has also been implicated with other serial killers. Of the 11 known that died, 5 were men, 4 were women, and 2 were toddlers. The oldest victim was in their mid-30s, and Lake's brother may also have been amongst the victims. Details regarding this case are mixed, but it is clear how they got caught. After a shoplifting incident via Ning, and Lake messing up by showing a victim's ID, Lake was then arrested for possessing a banned silencer. In jail, Lake wrote a message for his ex-wife, then killed himself via cyanide capsules sewn in his clothing. It took 4 days for him to die. Ning fled to Canada and was eventually caught and sent back. A search of their compound revealed a cache of videos and photographs. I'm sure all of the victims were represented, but most notable were Kathleen Allen and Brenda O'Connor. There was also a victor of Deborah Dubbs being, I assume, raped to death. Police also found a burial site with 45 pounds of bones. And then police found a hidden windowless cell with a mattress and a bucket. I've mentioned elsewhere that kidnappers have a special place in my nightmares, and this video has been particularly difficult to make already. The imagination doesn't want to go there, and not everything has been left for the imagination anyway. Some of the footage was somehow leaked, and it's hard to watch. The families of the victims were almost certainly dead by the time they were recording, and Lake and Ning display such cynicism it makes one shudder. However, it's a fascinating insight into what these situations are really like. There's little drama, just cold reality. On top of everything, Lake had a wife at the time who cooperated with the police for immunity. Her name was Claralyn Balazes, aka Cricket, and she can be seen in some of the footage. But I've also heard her and Lake divorced before the crime spree, but remained friends. It's totally unknown just how involved she was or how much she knew, and we've heard all that before. There's a lot about this case that's unknown, but unlike some of the other cases I've covered so far, the gaps in this case are conspicuous. I think the authorities are hiding things out of respect for the victims, and once again my wicked imagination torments me. Ultimately, Ning was sentenced to death after a controversial trial. Ning went through 10 different attorneys before trying to defend himself. He may have had a dependent personality disorder and an IQ of 65, but I don't know for sure. I don't know much for sure, and I can't tell if that's worse than knowing.
If you don't like it, would I like me to put it in writing?
So ends another chapter, and it's just going to keep getting worse.